What happens when the world's most explosive geopolitical powder keg is also the exact same place we get the magical powder that feeds half the human race? This is Critical Path, where we explore stories and innovations about our global supply chain that connect our world to your everyday life. Imagine for a second that you are a plant, not a particularly ambitious plant, just a standard stalk of corn, hanging out in a field, trying to do your job, which is to grow big and tall, so a human or a cow can eat you. To do this, you need a few basic things. You need sunlight, you need water, and you need nitrogen. Now, nitrogen is literally everywhere. It makes up 78% of the air we breathe. You are swimming in it right now. As a plant, you are surrounded by an all-you-can-eat buffet of atmospheric nitrogen. But there is a catch. A massive, evolutionary joke of a catch. Atmospheric nitrogen exists as two nitrogen atoms bound together by a triple covalent bond. In the world of chemistry, a triple bond is essentially the equivalent of two toddlers aggressively holding onto the exact same toy truck and absolutely refusing to let go. It is one of the strongest chemical bonds in nature. Plants, despite being surrounded by nitrogen, cannot break this bond. They are starving at a banquet. For millions of years, the only way plants got usable, reactive nitrogen, was if a bolt of lightning literally blasted the molecules apart in the sky, or if some highly specialized, overachieving bacteria in the soil did the heavy lifting for them. Because of this brutal bottleneck, human agriculture was entirely capped by the natural nitrogen cycle. If you wanted more food, you needed more land, or you needed to shovel massive amounts of animal manure onto your fields. We were completely tethered to the natural limitations of dirt. And then, humanity did what humanity does best. We decided we did not like nature's rules, and we brute forced a solution. Enter the Haber-Bosch process, widely considered the single most significant technological intervention in the history of human ecology. We figured out a way to artificially rip atmospheric nitrogen apart and smash it together with hydrogen under terrifying amounts of heat and pressure to create ammonia. Ammonia is the foundational building block for all synthetic nitrogenous fertilizers. With this one invention, we effectively decoupled the human population from the constraints of the soil. Today, in our modern global economy, nitrogen fertilizer underpins approximately 50% of the world's entire food production. Half of the protein in your body right now is likely constructed from nitrogen that was industrially fixed in a massive, terrifyingly hot metal tube. But here is where our incredible scientific triumph runs face first into the brick wall of modern geopolitics. The production of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is an unbelievably energy-intensive industrial process. It relies almost entirely on natural gas. Natural gas is not just the fuel that heats up the massive metal tubes, it is the actual physical feedstock, the primary ingredient used to get the hydrogen needed to make ammonia. In a modern industrial facility, the hydrogen is typically sourced through a process called steam methane reforming. To oversimplify a very complex and explosive chemical reaction, we take methane, which is natural gas, and water. We expose them to extreme heat. The methane and water react to form carbon monoxide and hydrogen gas. Then, we take that carbon monoxide and more water, and react them again to get carbon dioxide and even more hydrogen gas. Finally, we take all that newly liberated hydrogen and introduce it to our stubbornly bonded atmospheric nitrogen. We squeeze them together with ungodly pressure, and boom, you get ammonia. Because of all this molecular wrestling, fossil gas represents somewhere between 60% and 80% of the total production cost of nitrogen fertilizer. This means that the entire global agricultural sector is fundamentally, irreversibly, and terrifyingly vulnerable to any volatility in the natural gas market. If natural gas gets expensive, food gets expensive. If natural gas disappears, food disappears. And this brings us to the central stage of our modern logistical nightmare: the Persian Gulf. If you are a country with massive, sprawling reserves of incredibly cheap natural gas, you are sitting on an absolute goldmine. And no region on the planet has more cheap gas than the Persian Gulf. Qatar, Iran, and Saudi Arabia together hold more than half of the world's proven natural gas reserves. Because these Middle Eastern nations have so much cheap gas, they did the incredibly smart, totally logical economic thing. They moved down the value chain. Instead of just piping raw gas onto ships, they built massive, sprawling, multi-billion-dollar, export-oriented fertilizer complexes. The Persian Gulf evolved from just being the world's gas station into becoming the world's primary manufacturing base for the nutrients required by the global breadbaskets. By the mid-2020s, the Persian Gulf was accounting for roughly 35% of the global seaborne urea trade and 50% of global sulfur exports. They became the anchor of global nitrogen. Let us introduce our main characters in this region. First, we have Qatar. Through its state-owned entities, Qatar operates some of the largest integrated ammonia and urea plants on the face of the earth. They alone account for roughly 11% of all global urea exports, shipping out somewhere between 5.5 and 6 million tons annually to places like India, the United States, Thailand, and South Africa. Next, we have Saudi Arabia. They are the biggest overall fertilizer exporter in the entire region, shipping out an absolutely staggering 16 million tons annually. That represents 25% of the entire Middle East's exports. Through their state mining company, they have also become a dominant, unstoppable force in the global phosphate market. And then, we have Iran. Iran. The sanctions surplus. Despite decades of intense Western economic sanctions, Iran somehow emerged as the world's fourth largest exporter of urea by mid-2025. By heavily leveraging their massive domestic gas reserves, they crank out approximately 5 million tons of urea every single year, primarily targeting major markets in China, India, and Afghanistan. So, to summarize our setup, half the world's food requires industrial nitrogen. Industrial nitrogen requires massive amounts of natural gas, and all the cheapest natural gas and biggest factories are highly concentrated in the Persian Gulf. What could possibly go wrong? Well, let us fast forward to early 2026. The geopolitical tension in the Middle East finally snapped. We saw an extreme escalation of military conflict involving the United States, Israel, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Direct military strikes hit critical infrastructure. The Ras Al Khaimah industrial city in Qatar, which is the world's absolute largest liquefied natural gas and industrial complex, sustained damage and forced a total halt in production for urea, ammonia, methanol, and sulfur. Over in Iran, infrastructure like the Karg Island terminal, which handles 90% of the country's oil and a huge portion of its gas and sulfur exports, was heavily targeted. This effectively neutralized a major portion of the global nitrogen surplus in a matter of days. But the factories blowing up is not even the worst part. The worst part is the water. If you look at a map of the Persian Gulf, you will notice that all of these massive countries and all of these huge fertilizer factories have only one way out to the open ocean. It is a tiny, incredibly narrow maritime corridor separating Iran from the Musandam Peninsula of Oman. It is called the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is only 21 miles wide. 21 miles. For context, that is less than the distance of a standard marathon. You could technically run across it in a few hours if you were incredibly fit, and also if water was land, which it isn't. This tiny, vulnerable bathtub drain of a waterway is famous for handling about 20% of the world's petroleum liquids. But what the mainstream news often forgets to mention is that the Strait of Hormuz is also the primary artery for global plant nutrients. Analysts estimate that between 25% and 35% of all globally traded nitrogen fertilizers literally have to float through this 21-mile gap. Following the military strikes in late February of 2026, a de facto blockade of the strait was implemented. Maritime traffic simply ground to a near-complete, terrifying halt. At any given moment, there are roughly 170 to 200 massive merchant ships physically trapped inside the Gulf, or idling nervously outside of it, waiting for a security clearance that isn't coming. This blockade does not merely make energy more expensive. It physically, violently severs the connection between the world's largest nitrogen surplus and the world's most productive agricultural regions. And as if a global shortage of nitrogen was not bad enough, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz triggered a deeply annoying, highly destructive side quest, the Great Sulfur Crisis of 2026. You see, the Middle East accounts for approximately 45 to 50% of the global trade in sulfur. Most of this sulfur is a byproduct of processing oil and gas. Now you might be thinking, who cares about sulfur? It smells like rotten eggs and demons. Well, agriculture cares. Deeply. Sulfur is the essential raw material required for producing sulfuric acid. And you desperately need sulfuric acid to react with raw phosphate rock to produce soluble fertilizers like diammonium phosphate and monoammonium phosphate. So because the Strait of Hormuz is closed, a dual nutrient crisis has been unleashed upon the world. Even if a massive phosphate producer in Morocco or the United States has a mountain of phosphate rock sitting in their backyard, They cannot do anything with it, because the global shortage of sulfur has restricted their ability to actually manufacture the finished fertilizer products that farmers need. It is a logistical domino effect of epic proportions. Furthermore, the effective removal of Saudi supply from the global market due to maritime risks essentially strands 15 to 20% of the world's traded phosphates. Unsurprisingly, when you take a quarter of the world's plant food and lock it behind a wall of military drones and warships, the global economic markets tend to throw an absolute spectacular tantrum. The immediate effect of the Hormuz disruption was a violent, face-melting repricing of nitrogen benchmarks. Within a single week following the outbreak of hostilities, Egyptian urea prices, which act as a primary global benchmark, surged by more than 25%. They skyrocketed from roughly $484 per metric ton to a blistering $625. Over in the United States, at the port of New Orleans, urea prices spiked to trade between $520 and $550 per ton, a sharp, painful increase from the previous week's average of $475. But the spot price of fertilizer is only half the economic nightmare. The other half is the complete and total collapse of the maritime insurance market. If you own a massive cargo ship, you need insurance. On a normal, boring Tuesday in early 2026, the war risk insurance premiums for a vessel transiting the Strait of Hormuz were a fairly reasonable 0.2% to 0.25% of the ship's total value. But then the missiles started flying. By early March, insurance providers basically looked at the Persian Gulf, screamed in terror, and withdrew standard war risk coverage entirely. If you still absolutely had to sail through the Gulf, those insurance rates jumped a staggering 12-fold, rocketing up to between 1% and 3% of the hull's value. Let us do some quick math. Let us say you own a modern bulk carrier or tanker valued at $100 million. Prior to the conflict, your insurance premium for a single transit through the strait would cost you about $250,000. Expensive, but manageable. Following the strikes, that exact same single transit premium skyrocketed to $3 million. $3 million. Just for the privilege of hoping your ship does not get blown up. This apocalyptic surge in insurance costs, combined with the very real, physical risk of drone and missile attacks, rendered commercial shipping through the strait effectively impossible for the private sector. It does not matter if politicians go on television and declare that the waterway is legally open. If the insurance actuaries in London say it is closed, it is closed. So, what do the shipping companies do? Industry giants made the agonizing decision to completely suspend all crossings of the Strait of Hormuz. Instead, they decided to take the scenic route. They began rerouting their massive vessels all the way around the continent of Africa, navigating past the Cape of Good Hope. Historically, the Cape of Good Hope is known for beautiful scenery, great white sharks, and being an absolute nightmare for maritime navigation. Logistically and financially, this detour is incredibly punishing. Let us say you have a ship traveling from Asia to Northwest Europe. Normally, you would cruise nicely through the Middle East and the Suez Canal, and it would take you about 16 days. If you reroute around Africa, that exact same voyage now takes 32 days. You have literally doubled the transit time. This massive detour adds approximately 3,500 extra nautical miles to the journey. And ships do not run on hopes and dreams. They run on massive amounts of highly expensive fuel. The detour incurs roughly $933,000 to $1 million in incremental fuel costs per single voyage. And of course, the shipping companies are absolutely not going to absorb those extra costs out of the goodness of their hearts. They immediately pass the pain directly onto the consumer by introducing massive emergency freight surcharges. Some companies implemented a brutal $800 per container surcharge. Others went even further, slapping emergency increases of up to $3,800 for specialized or refrigerated equipment. The disruption of the Persian Gulf fertilizer hub sent immediate, severe shockwaves straight into the heart of the world's most populous and agriculturally productive nations. We are talking about critical national security vulnerabilities being exposed in real time. Let us take a little global tour of the misery. Our first stop is India. India is facing a national security crisis. They are perhaps the single most exposed nation in the world to the Hormuz crisis. They import roughly 20 to 25% of their total fertilizer requirement straight from the Arabian Gulf. In total, 59% of their 10.2 million tons of urea imports came from the Persian Gulf. The 2026 conflict endangered India's access to these inputs at the worst possible moment. India's fertilizer imports were already on track to hit a record-breaking $18 billion due to incredibly strong monsoon demand. We are talking about a nation with a population of 1.4 billion people, where a huge portion of the workforce is directly employed in agriculture. Any reduction in fertilizer availability could trigger widespread social instability and a terrifying collapse in food security. Next, let us fly over to Brazil. Brazil is the export engine of the world. They are the world's leading exporter of soybeans and a massive producer of maize. But Brazil has a dirty little secret. They depend on international imports for more than 90% of their urea requirements. Approximately 35% of those imports come straight from the Middle East. As the cost of nitrogen and phosphate skyrockets, many farmers are forced to make a terrible choice. They either switch to less productive alternative crops, or they simply reduce the amount of fertilizer they apply to their fields. Either choice directly threatens the massive export volumes that serve as the anchor for the entire Brazilian economy. Down in Australia, the situation is equally grim. Earlier in the decade, Australia completely shut down its last domestic urea manufacturing plants, opting for cheaper imports. They became entirely reliant on foreign supply, with the Persian Gulf serving as their primary gas station. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz left Australian agricultural exporters stranded, facing wildly increased costs, massive delays, and the terrifying potential for a complete supply vacuum. Meanwhile, in the United States, the situation was slightly different, but no less painful. The timing of the March 2026 conflict was an absolute catastrophe for American farmers. You see, March, April, and May are the big months for United States fertilizer imports, as everyone scrambles to get ready for the crucial spring planting season. Because it takes roughly 30 to 45 days for a cargo ship to transit from the Middle East to the port of New Orleans. All those ships that suddenly got blocked or rerouted in early March were the exact ships intended to provide the final, critical fertilizer volumes for the entire 2026 American crop. Input costs soared by an estimated $15 to $25 per acre for urea nitrogen alone. Finally, let us look at Europe. Europe's fertilizer industry was facing a dual, existential threat. Following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the European Union aggressively moved away from relying on Russian pipeline gas and shifted toward a strategy heavily reliant on liquefied natural gas imported by ship from Qatar and the United States. The March 2026 crisis brilliantly, painfully exposed the Achilles heel of this entire strategy. The halt of Qatari liquefied natural gas production instantly triggered a massive 40% surge in the benchmark for European gas prices. Prices violently jumped from €32 per megawatt-hour to over €52 in a single week. Because natural gas represents up to 80% of the production costs for making nitrogen fertilizers, European plants become instantly uncompetitive. The very second gas prices spike, leading to a total, devastating cessation of domestic nitrogen manufacturing across the entire European Union. But beyond the boardrooms and the commodity trading floors, the most enduring story of the 2026 Persian Gulf War was not written in oil prices or insurance premiums. It was written in crop yields. Modern staple crops like maize, wheat, and rice are highly, almost aggressively responsive to synthetic nitrogen. Decades of agronomic research indicate that simply adding nitrogen can increase a field's maize yields by a staggering 50.3% to 55.7%. Wheat yields jump by 30.0% to 40.0%. The flip side of this equation is terrifying. Even incredibly modest reductions in fertilizer application rates produce disproportionately massive, devastating declines in crop yield. For millions of farmers, the inability to access Gulf-linked nitrogen forced them to significantly reduce application rates. Any reduction in nitrogen availability in the spring translates directly, mathematically, into a much tighter global grain balance, significantly higher feed costs for livestock, and painfully elevated retail food prices by the end of the year. And as if all of this was not bad enough, the Hormuz crisis also managed to cripple the movement of high-value, highly perishable food products. The military conflict completely disrupted approximately 18% of global air cargo and air freight capacity. Suddenly, temperature-sensitive food ingredients, chilled dairy proteins, fresh produce, and high-end seafood were grounded. Down on the water, an estimated 450,000 20-foot equivalent units of shipping containers were trapped inside the Gulf. A massive, horrifying portion of these containers were refrigerated units packed full of temperature-sensitive agricultural products. Thousands of metal boxes full of rotting food were stuck in the sweltering heat. For import-dependent Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, which import a staggering 80% to 90% of their total food supply, this logistical freeze threatened immediate severe scarcity. Ultimately, the 2026 Persian Gulf crisis served as a brutal, unforgettable demonstration of a fundamental truth. The modern global food system is not really a farming system. It is a hydrocarbon-conversion system. We are literally eating processed natural gas. The unfolding fertilizer shock proved to be a second-round shock to global food security that was far more severe, deeply ingrained, and widely ranging than any traditional energy crisis. For global policymakers, massive agricultural conglomerates, and everyday farmers, the terrifying lessons are overwhelmingly clear. The extreme concentration of global nitrogen production in a single geopolitically volatile region is a profound, systemic risk to human survival. Furthermore, the technological dream of decoupling our nitrogen fixation from fossil gas entirely, through the rapid development of renewable green ammonia, has permanently transitioned from being a polite, long-term environmental goal into an absolute, immediate national security imperative. Because until the global food system can successfully reduce its overwhelming dependency on the Persian Gulf hub, the daily caloric security of more than half the world's entire population remains totally at the mercy of the 21-mile-wide chokepoint of the Strait of Hormuz. And that brings us to the end of today's journey along the critical path. We have seen how deeply reliant our morning toast and evening salads are on microscopic chemical bonds, giant natural gas facilities, and the incredibly fragile peace of a single maritime chokepoint. So I want to pose a question to all of you. If you were put in charge of a nation's agricultural security tomorrow, would you invest billions into heavily subsidizing green ammonia technology to build domestic independence? Or would you focus on building massive, multi-year physical stockpiles of traditional fertilizer, accepting the enormous storage costs? Let us know your strategy in the comments down below. Thanks for listening and watching. Please like and subscribe, and make sure to check out our other videos about the global supply chain.